Happy Tuesday, everyone. Here is your video today. We're going to talk about other religions and beliefs, and then look a little more at fundamentalism and extremism, and possibly related to that is terrorism as well. So starting with our other religions and beliefs, we're going to look at some of these more folk religions that are going to be much more isolated. Indigenous religions, like I said, tend to be very localized. You're only going to find them in one particular community, and generally there's an ethnic component. We would categorize them as ethnic religions. That's passed down from generation to generation. Many indigenous religions place a high premium on the natural world and respect for nature, making sure that the part of their just way of living is respecting nature. Again, I know it's a horrible example, but if we go back to Pocahontas, the Disney movie, while an awful portrayal of what indigenous American life was like, it does convey the idea of the importance of nature to that group of people. Many times these indigenous religions will also practice animism, in belief that not only is nature important, but nature has spirits that they can interact with. There is no one central belief system for indigenous religions. Like I said, since they're very localized and isolated, they don't line up very well with other indigenous religions or even larger religions. But what's kind of unique about them and special is that they survive today, even in the face of globalization. As popular culture spreads, as Christianity and other large religions spread, we still see these indigenous religions surviving, much like isolated languages. They still thrive today. Shamanism is typically a form of an indigenous religion that includes a shaman. A shaman is some sort of religious leader, or could just be seen as a teacher, someone knowledgeable in the indigenous religion. Shamanism is historically thought of and very inaccurately thought of as witch doctors. You notice that people don't use that term anymore, understanding that there's much more complexity going on in these religions. These are relatively isolated, and you're still going to find a wide divergent set of beliefs within shamanism, but they still put this leader or medium or teacher at the center of their religious practices. Secularism you can almost think of as the opposite of religion. Secularism is this broad idea that we shouldn't let religion necessarily influence our day-to-day life, or especially our political systems. About half of the world's population is considered to have a religious affiliation, but that doesn't mean that they can't be secular at the same time. Many religious people agree with the idea that religion shouldn't play a role in politics. Others don't. Secularism is not mutually exclusive with religion, but oftentimes we talk about it like it is. Some interesting just kind of statistics about secularism is that when we have, or religion in general, is when you see a country that has a large immigrant population, you're going to have a greater sense of religiosity, or a number of people that say they are religious within that country. Immigrants tend to value and bring their religion with them. That being said, and as religious people constitute over half of the world's population, research shows that people are unhappy with organized religion. That is very hierarchical and structured. More and more people are saying perhaps that they're spiritual rather than religious, or that they follow the beliefs of the religion but not necessarily the practices. Some places take secularism to the extreme, and if we look at communist countries, they tend to not only not pay attention to religion, but actually try to stop religious practices. The Soviet Union, when they were a country, they closed all but a very few of the Eastern Orthodox churches in the country. That dates back, or that kind of traces its back to Karl Marx, who we've talked about before, who was not a fan of religion. And so as the Soviet Union is looking at developing their political system and their economic system, they included with that a crackdown on religious practices. The Maoist, which is another form of communism, government in China, also doesn't like Confucianism, Confucianism leads people to question the government and try to take a role in it, while the communist government in China wants to handpick its leaders, and so they push back against Confucianism. While things are getting better, China does also have a long history of oppressing Christians. Every once in a while, you hear about a group of Christians in China that are terrorized, that are attacked, or that have to have secret meetings because the government does not necessarily approve of Christianity in the country. All right, this is another hugely important map. This is going to show you the distribution of religion throughout the world. This map is on pages 210 and 211 in your textbook, and I really would advise you to spend some time with this map, especially noting a few patterns. First of all, we already have talked about the United States patterns, but you'll notice that South America is also very, very, very heavily Catholic. We looked with Islam, the spread of Islam throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. You're also going to get parts into Eastern Europe as well. And it doesn't show up here great, but also in the Balkan Peninsula, there's a lot of, you'll find a lot of Muslims in that particular area. India is going to be our only country in that we find a Hindu majority population. And yeah, I guess just make sure you spend some time with this map. It tends to show up on the AP exam. We're going to move on to fundamentalism and extremism now, starting with some definitions. Fundamentalism is strict adherence to the teachings and holy texts of a religion. That is viewing the holy text as literal, that an individual would look at perhaps the Bible and say everything in here is literal truth 100% of the time. So fundamentalism is looking at getting back to the original teachings of a religion. It is extremely important to note that fundamentalism and extremism show up in every religion. This is not something that is isolated to just a few religions. Every religion has a fundamentalist branch and perhaps even an extremist branch. Modern fundamentalism is gaining in popularity largely because there's individuals that view society as breaking down, as losing its sense of morality, and trying to restore a sense of morality through a literal interpretation of a religious text. Extremism is fundamentalism, but just carried out to the point of violence. This is where we're going to talk about like terrorists that you would find in all sorts of these religions. Fundamentalism in Christianity has been around as long as Christianity has been around. In the Catholic Church, in the Protestant churches, fundamentalism looks a little different. Within the Catholic Church, it's resistance to innovation that they see as not compatible with their tenets of faith. And so some things that go with that are birth control and family planning. The use of contraception is prohibited in Catholicism unless under some really extreme circumstances. Also, there are going to be very strict interpretations about what the role of women in society is. A sect is a small group of religious followers that break off from a mainstream religion. Every religion has these sects, and this is where you oftentimes find the fundamentalism in them. Within Protestantism, you're going to see a little bit different approach to fundamentalism. While the Catholic Church fundamentalism is going to just try to resist specific innovations or specific pieces of modern society, Protestant fundamentalism wants to bring all of society in a line with their literal biblical teachings. This might look at like those mega churches that you might see on TV that are popular, especially throughout the South and some parts of the Midwest. These are multi-million-dollar stadiums that bring in large crowds, have weekly, if not more often, broadcast services that people can watch. Westboro Baptist is probably going to be the best example of an extremist religious sect in the United States, particularly with fundamentalism. Westboro Baptist gets a lot of its fame, its notoriety from going and protesting anything that might be pro-LGBT individual. They do not particularly care for homosexuality or any LGBT individual for that matter. They also show up at military funerals and protest at military funerals, arguing that our soldiers that have passed away, that have died serving their country, died because God hates America. And so they go protest these funerals, trying to bring the country back in line with their extremely fundamentalist teachings. Judaism has its own forms of fundamentalism. There is fundamentalism within the Orthodox branch, and you're going to find a lot of different views and beliefs. The Hasidic Jews that we talked about last week probably are fundamentalists. They're going to be very literal interpretations of the Torah, the Talmud, and the Tanakh. I hope that kind of shows you that fundamentalism in of itself is not a bad thing. It's especially when extremism gets involved in the violence, that creates problems. There are extremist sects within Judaism, the Kach and the Kahin Kai. These are openly racist groups that you're going to find in Israel and throughout the Middle East. So much so that even the Israeli government has prohibited these political parties or these groups from participating in elections. They raise so much fear and terror, even among their Jewish counterparts. The international community considers both Kach and Kahin Kai to be terrorist organizations. And then in Islam, this is probably where you're most familiar with fundamentalism and extremism, thanks to popular culture and the news. A really good example of fundamentalism in Islam is the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. The news might confuse you in thinking that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are the same thing, and they are not. Al-Qaeda is an international terrorist organization, while the Taliban is a political party that gained power in Afghanistan in 1996. The Taliban is made up mostly of members of Al-Qaeda, and that's where we get the confusion that Al-Qaeda and Taliban are the same thing, but they are not. The Taliban believes in strict, what we would call Sharia law, S-H-A-R-I-A, Sharia, that's using the Quran to dictate a country's laws and regulations. And some examples up here: men can be beaten for shaving their beard, we cut the hands off of thieves, homosexual individuals are buried alive. Oftentimes women are also targets in fundamentalist or extremist Islamic areas, and in many places, not many places, but in a few places, women are still prohibited from driving, and you'll find that if the right individuals or the wrong individuals find out if a woman has driven a car, that could end the woman's life. She can be put to death for that in some places. It is extremely important to note that most Muslims are not fundamentalists, they're not part of the Taliban, they're not terrorists. Most Muslim scholars are going to say the Taliban and these other terrorist organizations, and like ISIS would fall into this group too, are very much misinterpreting the Quran and using it for political reasons rather than actually looking at what the religious text says. All these fundamentalist groups, particularly in Islam, have very anti-US views because they see our culture as being too permissive, and our economic power and our military power as a threat to the rest of the world. The U.S. was successful in overthrowing the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001. However, if you're paying attention to what's going on in Afghanistan today, you'll note that the Taliban is actually growing in power today, as we've withdrawn mostly from Afghanistan and just mostly have a police force there. So the Taliban, while 10 years ago was kind of off the radar, they're certainly back today. Again, I'll be back tomorrow if you have any questions or want to talk about this. We'll spend Wednesday reviewing, making sure we're all on the same page, and then your test over all of culture, which, remember, that goes back to chapter 4 with folk and popular culture, chapter 5 with identity, chapter 6 with language, and chapter 7 with religion. All of that will be on your culture test, which will be on Thursday. See you later.